The baby bushbuck was no bigger than a house cat, standing frozen in the middle of a forest clearing, crying out in a voice that was more squeak than bleat. She had been calling for her mother for 3 hours now, her tiny body trembling with exhaustion and fear. Zuri watched from behind a thick cluster of wild banana plants, her heart breaking with each desperate cry. The fawn was maybe 2 days old, still wobbly on her impossibly thin legs, still carrying the white stripes and spots that marked her as a newborn. And she was completely, utterly alone. The sun was already past its peak, which meant the fawn had been separated from her mother since early morning. In the dense mountain forests of Rwanda's Nyungwe forest, 3 hours might as well be a lifetime. Leopards hunted these forests. Servals prowled for small prey. And a fawn this small, this vulnerable, wouldn't survive the night without her mother. Every conservation rule Zuri had ever learned screamed the same message: don't interfere. The mother will come back. But Zuri was a member of the Batwa people, and her ancestors had lived in these forests for thousands of years. She knew things that textbooks didn't teach. She knew the subtle signs that told the difference between temporary separation and permanent loss. And she knew, with growing certainty, that this mother wasn't coming back. Zuri looked at the fawn's thin legs, already scraped and bleeding from stumbling through the undergrowth. She saw the way the fawn's breathing was becoming shallow, the way her calls were growing weaker. And then Zuri did something that would break every modern conservation protocol, but that her grandmother would have called forest wisdom. She stepped out of hiding and walked toward the fawn, carrying with her an idea so clever, so rooted in ancient knowledge, that it would save the fawn's life and reunite her with her mother in a way that science was only beginning to understand. Zuri was 30 years old, a member of the Batwa tribe who had lived in Rwanda's mountain forests for thousands of years. In 2004, her people were evicted from the forest to protect endangered species. It had been devastating, cutting the Batwa off from the only life they had ever known. But Zuri had found a way back. She worked as a traditional knowledge consultant, teaching tourists and researchers about medicinal plants and forest tracking. It kept her grandmother's wisdom alive. That morning, Zuri had been deep in Nyungwe forest, gathering mushrooms and wild greens. That's when she heard the crying, a high-pitched, desperate sound that didn't belong in the peaceful afternoon. She found the fawn in a small clearing, a bushbuck, one of the forest's most secretive antelopes. Bushbuck mothers always hid their newborns in the thickest vegetation they could find. This fawn shouldn't be standing exposed in an open clearing. Zuri scanned the forest for the mother. Nothing. No protective doe standing guard. No answering call from the undergrowth. Zuri stayed hidden and watched, giving the mother time to return. 1 hour passed. 2 hours. 3 hours. The fawn grew weaker with each passing minute, her calls fading to whispers. Finally, Zuri couldn't wait any longer. She emerged from hiding, speaking softly in Kinyarwanda. The fawn tried to run but collapsed, too exhausted to escape. Zuri knelt beside her and gently touched her head. The fawn was burning with fever, dehydration, stress, possibly infection. Without help, she wouldn't survive another 6 hours. But Zuri knew she couldn't just take the fawn to a rescue center. Bottle-feeding wild bushbuck rarely worked, and they became habituated to humans, unable to return to the wild. No, Zuri needed to reunite the fawn with her mother. But how do you find one specific deer in thousands of hectares of dense forest? The answer came from her grandmother's voice, echoing across the years. The forest speaks in sense, child. Learn that language and you can say anything. Zuri carefully lifted the fawn. She weighed barely 3 kilograms, and carried her deeper into the forest. She was searching for something specific, and after 20 minutes, she found it. A bushbuck trail. Fresh tracks pressed into soft mud, droppings that were still moist, browse marks on vegetation. But most importantly, there were 2 sets of tracks, adult and tiny. The mother and baby had been here together that morning. Something had separated them, and the mother was likely searching. But the forest was vast, the vegetation so thick that finding each other seemed impossible. Zuri needed to give the mother a reason to come to this exact location. First, she gathered soil from the deer trail, soil saturated with the doe's scent. She rubbed this gently over the fawn's coat, masking any human smell and making the fawn smell like she belonged to this territory. Next, she collected fresh bushbuck droppings and crushed them, creating a scent trail that would draw the mother toward this spot. Then came the crucial part, her grandmother's clever idea. Zuri had noticed something during her hours of watching. The fawn only called when she had energy. Now, too exhausted and dehydrated, she was silent. But a silent fawn was invisible to a searching mother. The mother was probably listening for her baby's calls. But the fawn was too weak to be heard from any distance. So Zuri became the fawn's voice. As a child, she had learned to mimic animal calls, a skill all Batwa possessed. She had never mimicked a bushbuck fawn before, but she had heard it for 3 hours. She understood its cadence, its pitch, a high-pitched mee that carried through the forest. Zuri placed the fawn in a small hollow beside the trail, well hidden by ferns but accessible. Then she climbed into a nearby tree where she could watch but remain invisible. And she began to call. Me, me, me. 5 seconds of calling, then 30 seconds of silence. The exact pattern the fawn had used. And she waited. 30 minutes passed. Zuri continued her periodic calling, creating a beacon of sound through the dense forest. An hour passed. Still no mother. Zuri checked on the fawn. She was lying quietly, eyes half closed, conserving her remaining energy. 90 minutes passed. Zuri began to doubt. Maybe the mother was truly gone. Maybe the forest was too vast. But her grandmother's voice whispered, "Patience is the forest's first lesson." And then Zuri heard it, the sharp alarm bark of a bushbuck doe, coming from the west. Maybe 200 meters away. The doe had heard the calls. She was coming. Zuri called again, louder, more urgent. The doe answered, closer now. Maybe 100 meters. Below, the fawn's head lifted. She heard something in that doe's call that Zuri's human ears couldn't detect, but that the fawn recognized instantly as her mother. The fawn tried to stand, stumbled, tried again. She stayed upright, swaying, and made her own call, weak but filled with desperate hope. Zuri went silent. Mother and baby were communicating now. The doe appeared at the clearing's edge like a spirit from shadow, reddish-brown coat, large ears swiveling, testing the air for danger. She saw the fawn and froze. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other. The fawn took one wobbly step forward. Then another. The doe approached cautiously, sniffing the air. Zuri held absolutely still in her tree, barely breathing. The doe reached her fawn and began sniffing her thoroughly, checking for injury, for wrong scents. Zuri's scent masking had worked perfectly. The fawn smelled of forest soil, of bushbuck territory, of home. The fawn pressed against her mother's legs, making soft sounds of relief. And then the doe lowered her head and began grooming her baby with her tongue, licking away the fear and exhaustion, welcoming her back. The fawn immediately began nursing, her small tail wagging frantically. The doe stood still, letting her baby feed, nuzzling her head gently. Zuri watched for 10 more minutes, making sure the reunion was complete. Then she climbed down silently and began walking away, leaving them to their reunion. She had walked 20 meters when she heard a sound. She turned. The doe was standing at the trail's edge, watching her. The fawn nursed contentedly beside her. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Zuri placed both palms over her heart, a traditional Batwa gesture of respect. The doe tilted her head slightly, as if acknowledging the gesture, then turned and led her fawn into the forest, both disappearing into green shadows. 2 days later, a park ranger vehicle arrived at Zuri's village. Jean-Paul, a senior ranger, climbed out looking serious. "Zuri, I heard you handled a wild bushbuck fawn in the forest. You know that's against regulations." Zuri's heart sank. "I found an abandoned fawn and reunited her with her mother. She wouldn't have survived the 4 hours it would take for your team to reach that location." Jean-Paul's expression softened. "Actually, I'm not here to reprimand you. Your method worked perfectly. We've been monitoring the area with camera traps. The fawn is thriving. The mother kept her protected. This is remarkable. When we've tried reunifications before, the success rate was maybe 30%. He pulled out his phone, showing images of a healthy doe and fawn together. The vocal mimicry to draw the mother in, the scent masking, we would never have thought of that. Your grandmother's method was far superior to our protocols. He paused. The Rwanda Development Board wants to hire you as a traditional knowledge specialist. We're creating a program to document Batwa forest wisdom and incorporate it into our wildlife management. Zuri stared at him, surprised. You want to honor the knowledge you dismissed when you evicted us? Yes, Jean-Paul said quietly. Evicting the Batwa was a mistake, not just for your people, but for the forest. Your knowledge is part of how this ecosystem stays healthy. We need to bring you back, not as visitors, but as partners. Over the next year, Zuri worked with the Rwanda Development Board to document traditional Batwa forest knowledge. She brought in her grandmother and other elders, teaching rangers techniques passed down for generations. The success rate for mother-young reunifications jumped from 30% to 78%. Rangers learned scent masking, vocal mimicry, the art of patient waiting. They learned that sometimes the best intervention was the most subtle one. One afternoon, nearly a year after the rescue, Zuri was training new rangers in the forest. A young bushbuck emerged from the undergrowth, an adolescent now, showing no fear of the humans. Zuri noticed distinctive scars on the bushbuck's front legs, exactly where the tiny fawn had scraped herself on rocks. It was her, the fawn she had saved. The young bushbuck looked at Zuri for one moment, then bounded gracefully into the forest, healthy and wild and free. Zuri stood there with tears on her face, understanding something profound. When the Batwa were evicted, everyone said it was to protect the forest from people. But what if the Batwa weren't separate from the forest? What if they were part of it? Their knowledge, their gentle interventions, their deep understanding actually helped the forest thrive. Modern conservation had taught that the best forest had no human presence. But maybe that was only true for humans who took without understanding. The Batwa hadn't taken from the forest. They had conversed with it, participated in it, maintained it. 3 years later, Zuri was teaching a group of Batwa teenagers in the forest, all born after the eviction, disconnected from their heritage. One of them suddenly grabbed her arm. "Auntie, listen." In the distance, a duiker fawn's distress call. Zuri turned to her 15-year-old nephew, Gasana. "What do you think we should do?" "We should help," he said. "Then you lead." Over the next 2 hours, Gasana used everything Zuri had taught him. He found the lost fawn, identified the mother's tracks, used scent masking, climbed a tree and mimicked the calls. 70 minutes later, the mother appeared and reunited with her baby. Gasana climbed down with tears streaming down his face. "It worked." "Of course it worked," Zuri said. "It's been working for thousands of years." That evening, Gasana spoke quietly. "I've been ashamed of being Batwa. Kids at school call us primitive. But today, I saved a life using knowledge thousands of years old. I spoke the forest's language." He paused. "Being Batwa isn't something to be ashamed of. It's powerful." That bushbuck fawn is 4 years old now, a mother herself, raising her own young in Nyungwe forest. She doesn't know she almost died, that she was hours from becoming another casualty. But somewhere in her memory, perhaps there's a trace of that afternoon, gentle hands that masked human scent with forest soil, a voice that called her mother home, the moment everything shifted from hopeless to hopeful. Zuri thinks about all the animals her grandmother helped over the decades, animals no one documented, but who survived because an old woman understood the forest's languages. That knowledge almost disappeared. If Zuri hadn't insisted on using it, if the park authorities hadn't recognized its value, it would have died with her grandmother's generation. But it didn't die. It adapted. It proved that indigenous knowledge and modern conservation aren't enemies, they're partners. The Batwa were called primitive. They were evicted in the name of conservation. But now, conservation itself is learning that the forest needs the Batwa's wisdom. If this story touched your heart, please share it. Tell us in the comments. Does your culture have traditional knowledge that deserves to be honored? Hit like and subscribe for more stories that prove conservation works best when we listen to all voices, especially the voices that spoke long before conservation had a name. Because somewhere in Nyungwe forest, A bushbuck walks with her fawns, alive because a Batwa woman remembered her grandmother's wisdom and had the courage to use it. The forest speaks many languages. Indigenous peoples never forgot how to listen. And sometimes, the oldest wisdom holds the cleverest solutions.